A while back, the admins had an idea. What if we introduce attributes to all items in the game? Ever since that, there has been a fervent discussion on if this is a good or a bad idea. I am personally vehemently against the idea. And in this video, I want to discuss exactly why and some other options on how the admins could achieve some of the things they wanted to achieve by adding attributes in a better way. The origin. Firstly, I want to talk about Crimson Gear. Now, giving attributes to other items like Necron, Storm, and everything makes them weaker and less interesting in comparison to items that currently don't have attributes. What I would like to add to this is how much less interesting it makes the entire Crimson Isles. Imagine, if you will, what will you want to get from the island if Kudra sets didn't exist? I can only imagine Magma Lord, skyblock experience, Blaze Slayer flares, equipment, new reforges, and enchantment. Those enchantments that come with all new content updates. I want you to consider it, because if you can get attributes on other gear, you don't really have a great reason to play Kudra at all. The admin said that they will provide other ways of getting attributes, so those don't matter. Enrager is effectively impossible to get, and other loot that could matter is enchantments and weight of feel, which, depending on how the admins implement attribute giving to items might not matter at all. Power creep. Now, certainly, introducing attributes to items would cause a massive amount of power creep. That is not an argument. Everybody knows that that's going to happen. Now, the way the admins can deal with this power creep issue, there's plenty of different ways. However, I would like to first discuss more on the effects it would have on the game immediately, if it wasn't balanced reasonably first. Basically, what would happen is people would get the attribute stat boosts on everyone. And admins would need to make things harder because of the extra stats everyone would be getting. But that is the problem. It would take huge amount of work to rebalance the game for this, and then it would force players to get attributes to do things that they were able to do before. For people who can't buy attributes, even when the other update would come, will get a massive nerf, like the old strength nerf, and like the strength nerf, these poor people would have to fork money again just to get back to where they were. Putting it in a different way, imagine you were able to do tier 5 refs, but then this attribute change comes, and because of the attribute that gives 30% more damage against revenants get a 30% HP boost to keep the game balanced. But now you do not have that attribute. And while you were able to do tier 5 refs, you cannot anymore. We can obviously argue that the admins could instead nerf the attributes, but why even add them if they must immediately make them less useful? I say we keep the old content the same way it was. Balancing issues. This would obviously cause different sort of balancing issues. For example, armors and pets that multiply stats under certain conditions. I like to use the example of Bad Person armor and Frozen Blaze. let's discuss bad person first. So, again, imagine getting a recomp, wisdom, necrotic, mana pool 10, mana regen, bad person armor. That is 1920 base mana if we use Loving Chestplate, which is the obvious choice. Now, during nights, that is two times stats. And during the Spooky Festival, that is 3 times stats. That is 3,840 and 5,760. Currently, Storm Armor with the same staff, so Recoms, Wisdoms, Necrotic, Mana Pools, well, not Mana Pool, but without the Mana Pool, Storm Armor would get 2,270 or 3,770 if it had Mana Pool as well. That is like bad person armor would be better every night. It would be better every night, and it would be an insane upgrade during spooky festivals. Now, the other example, Frozen Place. Frozen Place gets a stat boost whenever it's equipped with the Blaze Pet. Imagine Vitality 10, Speed 10, or any other attribute that adds armor base stats. Now the admins can prevent this by making none of the attributes increase base stats. But that's boring and makes the attributes less interesting. Also, balancing side, Terminator and Witherblades do not need any buffs. Honestly, I would add Atom Split, Juju Bow, Axe of the Shredded, some different armor sets like Necron, Final Destination. None of those need buffs. To highlight these items that don't need buffs, I want to mention what the admins themselves said in their forum post. I quote, We're looking to allow attributes onto all items to make it much easier to design items that exceed the power level of Crimson Isles items. If attributes were not applicable on items outside of Crimson Isles, they'll need bloated stats and abilities to compete with the Crimson Isles items. But the admins are shooting themselves in the foot by adding attributes to all items. If you want to make weapons that surpass Terminator and Hyperion, give those items attributes, not the old ones. That way, the next overpowered bow can have less stats than Terminator and still be better because it would have attributes while no other bow would have attributes. Now, admittedly, that is not as easy with armor or equipment, as the best in slot armors and equipment already have attributes. But again, do the same thing as I advised with weapons. Give attributes to all the next OP items, just do not buff the old ones. The next, for example, another case, if they want to add a new equipment that is stronger than the current equipment, simply give those items attributes, and that will simply make those items surpass equipment and far surpass equipment that don't have attributes. The next OP armor set after Crimson can be, for example, it can be the exact same as Necron armor and have attributes. That could be the next overpowered item they want to introduce. They wouldn't have to make an armor set that has more damage stats than current armors. They would simply have to combine the stats of Necron and the ability to make attributes, make a new item. Only give it to new, do not buff old ones. Additionally, adding attributes to old items would cause future pains. This point would only be an issue if the admins don't give enough attribute shards, but it should still be mentioned. Let's say that only 10 or 20 or 30%, a minority of all players can get attributes. This is simply because there's not enough of them, or they are way too expensive to acquire. Well, now the admins will need to balance all future combat content to be workable for those people who have attributes, to that small top minority. That means that only that minority can actually do the new content. No one else can do it. They do not have the gear or the equipment for it, because they do not have those attributes. This has already happened with Kutra, as you have to have multiple sets of good Kutra armor. You have to have Hyperion and Terminator. You have to have equipment. You have to have already maxed gear to that thing. So adding attributes to older items would make the next content be harder, because it would require people to have more attribute shards and have more items than they would currently need to have. Then something kind of, well, going from the point of things going for only the top players to things that only affect the new players. Gear creep, as I like to call it. It's kind of like power creep, but slightly different. What do I mean by gear creep? They aren't adding any new gear, but they are adding more stuff you need to apply to your gear for it to be usable. That is what I mean. You would need to apply attributes to your item. Now, as experienced skyblock players, that doesn't matter too much. We already know all the things you need to do to max a piece of armor. But new players don't. Adding more and more layers to gear, like attributes like hot potato books, like this will only confuse new players. Just think about it. What does a new player need to add to their first set of Shadow Assassin armor? There's hot potato books, there's fumings, there's enchantments, there's reforges, there's recoms, there's gems if applicable, there's fragging the armor if applicable, and so on. And it's not any easier when it comes to weapons. We don't need to add attributes to the long list of stuff new players need to learn early on. I feel like attributes should stay on late game items only to pace the number of things new players need to learn. It's kind of like gemstone slots. Most new items, well, most old items and most early game items do not have gemstone slots. This is precisely to not confuse newer players and have a simpler weapon. Exact same thing with fumings. Fumings become only available when you start doing dungeons. This is pacing it. But if they're introducing attributes to older gear, then that will not be as well paced. Lastly, on the directly negatives, is Iron Man players. How do you balance attributes between normal profiles and Iron Man? Currently, to get a tier 10 attribute, it takes 512 of the same attribute. Currently, Iron Man profiles really can't get that if they aren't doing Inferno Kudra, which I believe, while harsh is fine. But if you add attributes to all or most items, then Iron Man players need way more attributes. And at the current level that we're receiving attributes, that is just not doable. But if the admins boost attribute gains to a level where Iron Man players can max their gear, where Iron Man players can get that 512 tier 1 attributes would be way too easy to gain on normal profiles. And the admins have directly said that they are not making Iron Man exclusive content. It's going to be really hard to balance these two game modes on this aspect. Attributes as specialization. Now, this is the part which I agree with mostly. Yes, attributes would make weapons and gear more specialized and would allow for build crafting different sort of builds, which is a good idea that the admins have wanted to implement for a while. However, I feel like this build crafting shouldn't be implemented to current existing content, because the game isn't balanced for specialization. Most players hop from revs to Swens to Enderman to doing dungeons, then Kudra, then maybe farming, and then maybe some mining. And they would need unique gear for all of these activities if attributes became essential, which they probably should become essential, because if they aren't, why add them in the first place? This would be a worse pain for Iron Man players. But the idea of having unique builds does sound fun. Build crafting. Now, again, I want to first point out my idea of adding attributes to only new items. This would make new items more interesting, because just like Crimson Gear, it would have attributes. And it would make Crimson Gear and new items different from all the other gear because those old gear don't have attributes. This would make this new gear more unique and more powerful as a baseline. Now, this is the part where I want to talk about a different plan regarding build crafting. The admins have talked about making classes outside of the dungeons. The classes being mage, archer, and melee. I think that once that is implemented, they could transfer this build crafting to those classes instead of attributes. I believe that would be a better way than attributes. It's simply that attributes, almost no matter what, will cost way too much. Think about it. To swap the attributes on a weapon, you need to have two of the same weapon, or you lose all of the money and time you've invested on getting that weapon's attribute upgraded. But instead, the class system would be built around swapping builds. Then players, especially Iron Man, could swap their build to match the activity, just like with Power Stones, or to an extent Heart of the Mountain, or with Wither Blades, swapping from Hype to Syla when you're doing a melee activity, or swapping your Wither armors. Now, an argument I've seen people make is that adding attributes to old items would also bring earlier game attributes, maybe some attribute related NPCs and some new activities to get attributes. But none of that was confirmed in the alpha, nor was any of that confirmed in the forum post. The next update is almost definitely going to be the Rift update. After that, they were planning on doing foraging, and after foraging, they were planning on doing 1.0. So it would be a while until this attribute 2.0 update would come. And while all of these new attributes, earlier game attributes and attribute NPCs and activities to get attribute would be cool, we just cannot say that that would happen. So, to conclude this video, instead of attributes to every single item, they should add them to new items only, and to make new items more interesting, without taking too much away from Crimson Isle's gear. If Crimson Isles becomes this new base gear, this new Necron's armor, that would then lead to the next armor set. It would make sense. It would be the difference of attributes between Necron and Crimson. Secondly, I don't think attributes are a good way to get this build crafting idea. They are too limiting, like you have this cool gear that makes you super good at Eamon. Cool. How much did it cost you? Oh, all of your coins? Well, that sucks. Now you have to do that one activity, because all of your money is tied to your armor and you cannot change the attributes. Instead, it should be done with the outside dungeon class system that the admins pondered a while back. Thirdly, attributes will be a huge pain, time consumer, and a task for the admins to rebalance the game around. I think that those resources on the admin's end could be used better on other things, like the class system I mentioned. Lastly, I believe it's going to be impossible for the admins to balance attribute shard distribution so that both Iron Man and normal profiles would be happy. Or either there's going to be way too much and attributes become nothing, or there's way too little and Iron Man players cannot get enough. The admins will have to forget and not help one of these two modes. And considering at least 90% of skyblock players play on a normal profile, I don't think my odds of enjoying that update are too high. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on the attribute system being implemented on all gear. In the end, this is the admin's game. They can do what they want with it. But I feel like there's just way better ways of achieving the thing the admins wanted. The problem that the admins brought up was clearly that making attributes only to Crimson gear would make adding new gear hard, because they would have to give that gear incredibly high stats to compete with attributes. But instead, if you restrict attributes to Crimson gear and all the new gear, then they will solve that issue without affecting the balance of older game content. So that's just something to think about.